Today we are sticking in 1983, but instead of Canada, we are going to be transporting to a small town in Michigan and the murder of a 16-year-old boy. And this case reminded me a lot of the current Kylie Rodney case, but unlike her case being somewhat solved currently, 40 years later, the case of the 16-year-old boy has not been. I've been doing a lot of current cases recently, but I want to jump back to what I originally started doing on this channel, was doing a lot of older cases that are still unsolved, because there is so much coverage on a lot of these current bigger cases, which is amazing. I'm not saying it's not, but a lot of these older cases aren't getting as talked about anymore. And a lot of the people that are involved in these cases are aging out. And if there are people out there who still have secrets, they're going to be taking them to the grave. But hopefully shedding light on cases like this will maybe start helping bring this case back into public awareness, and maybe it'll make people start talking. Cases like these also have a ton of mystery and questions, and you will find out that today's case does as well. So today I'm going to be presenting you with the disturbing murder of Erik Cross and the alleged cover-up that happened afterwards. Now keep in mind that while I go through this case, I'm going to be presenting you the timeline as best as I could put it together, going through all of the interviews and stories and documentaries that were done on this case. But a lot of this information didn't come out right at the start of this case. It all came out like throughout the 40 years that this case has been evolving, and a lot of it has not come out until recently. But I did my best to try to create a coherent timeline, because there is a lot of information in this case that is just, it's wild, and you're gonna see. But unfortunately, the majority of this case is circumstantial. So right off the bat, before I get into the details, I just want to say, go do your own research on this case. Everything I'm going to be saying today is stuff that I've just found that is public knowledge. So for legal reasons, everything I'm going to be saying today is unfortunately alleged, because there hasn't been any prosecutions. But again, it's all public knowledge, and I'm just reciting things that I have found from documentaries and public sources. So with that, let's get into the case. Erik Sterling Cross was born September 25th of 1966. But at the time of his death, he was a blue-eyed, red-haired 16-year-old boy living in the small, rural, quiet town of Vicksburg, Michigan, which is about 130 miles west of Detroit. He lived there with his parents and his younger sister, Jackie, who were really, really close growing up. Erik also had a dog named Sally. The Cross family was described as loving Christmas and fishing and the simple pleasures of country life. And as a little boy, Erik was good-natured, a great big brother. He also loved being active and exploring outside with his little sister. Erik had always been described as a good kid growing up, but in the months leading up to his death, he'd started hanging out with friends more, going to parties more, and experimenting with alcohol. And all of that, for the most part, is normal for a teenager. However, Erik's father would be concerned that he had started hanging out with a bad crowd. And his sister said that this was a more recent development before his death. Now, I found this little story that his sister wrote on Erik's website really interesting. And I don't think it really has anything to do with his murder, but I think it really gives you a picture of who Erik was the month leading up to his death. It's about a month before Erik's murder, his parents and sister went on an overnight trip, and they left Erik alone at home. And when they arrived home the next day, they actually found a note on the counter from Erik that said he had ran away because he had gotten into a small car accident with his father's vehicle, and he wasn't supposed to be driving the car, so he had decided he was going to run away. But in the end, it actually ended up just being like a very minor fender bender, and it really wasn't anything too serious at all. Jackie wrote how she remembered going to her room thinking she was never going to see her big brother again. She continued by saying, "I looked out the back window and remembered the last time I had seen him. He had been riding his motorbike in the unplanted cornfield behind our house. I could see him in my mind's eye kicking up the dirt as he rode across the field. That's what he'd been doing when we left for the trip, and I wished so badly that I could see him again." Now, Erik eventually would be found hiding in a tent in the backyard because the family dog, Sally, was out in the back sniffing around this tent, and Jackie ended up going and finding that Erik was in this tent, and he told her not to tell her parents. And Jackie ended up keeping the secret that Erik was hiding in this tent in the backyard because she didn't want to disappoint her big brother. She looked up to him so much. And eventually they found out that Erik was in the tent, of course. And I think that story, although it has nothing really to do with Erik being murdered, is just a really good depiction of how teenagers are. They want to be so grown up. They want to, take the parents' car and go joyriding, and they want to go to parties and act like they're adults. But in the end, they still aren't adults. Even though they try to act mature, which is great. It's great to start maturing. They still are children inside. And I think that really shows that even though Erik was 16, he had, taken this car joyriding, he was feeling like he was maturing. He still wrote a note that he was running away and then hid in the backyard. like a little kid would do. And I think that should really paint a picture to you all that all of the key players in this story, in this case, in this murder, were all teenagers for the most part. There's some adults involved in the aftermath. They were 15, 16, like they were children still. And I think that's what makes this case really mind-blowing. So I'm now going to jump to a month later and the day that Erik would be murdered. June 25th of 1983, Erik was getting ready to attend a graduation party for the older kids in his school. So keep in mind, Erik was not graduating at this time. He was still 16. This was a graduation party for all of the 12th graders. His parents, however, were under the assumption that he was actually going to hang out at his friend Bill Cook's house that night and that they were not going to a party. And his parents were fine with him going over to Bill's house. They were best friends, but they did tell him to be home around 11:30 because the next morning they were supposed to be getting up early to go on a trip to Detroit. And on top of that, Bill was also supposed to be going with them on this trip. Jackie remembers her big brother fixing his 80s hairdo in the mirror while the song The Look of Love played on the radio. Erik would then leave on foot, and that would be the last time that Jackie would ever see her big brother alive again. Now keep in mind that Vicksburg, Michigan is, again, a very rural country town. It's full of lakes and forests and country back roads, and a lot of kids in small towns, if they don't have their own vehicle, they're gonna go walk. And this party was actually less than a mile away from Erik's house. This party wasn't like just a normal little house party. This was actually going to be a huge kegger. And it was going to be at a lake house on Kimball Lake. And kids could pay an admission of $2 and then they could drink unlimited beer. And I think at one point they got about 4 or 5 kegs going. So just imagine how drunk these teenagers were about to be, where they could pay a $2 admission to the party and then drink an unlimited amount of alcohol. And let's just remember that the vast majority of these kids attending this party were underage because it was a graduation party for like 12th graders. And so they're going to be, 18 at the most. So from the timeline, it seems that Erik left his home, he met up with Bill Cook, and then they went over to this party around 7 to 7:30 p.m. Now, I'm about to mention a few names that are key players in this story and in this case, but I'm going to go a little more in depth into who these people are later. I didn't see mentioned when or where Brent Spalding showed up to this party, but he is a name you're going to be hearing time and time again in this case. Another group of kids that are key players in this story arrived at the party in a separate vehicle, namely Amber Thomas, who was Brent's girlfriend at the time, and she was only 15 years old. There was also Brent Spalding's younger sister and then his younger brother as well in this vehicle. And they all rode together in a vehicle and showed up at this party. Because sometime during the night, there are witnesses that state multiple times they seen Amber Thomas flirting with Erik. Now, Bill Cook, Erik's best friend, states that he last seen Erik sometime during the night at this party, and Erik was very drunk at this point.
So the last time you saw Erik Cross, where was he?
Sitting in a lawn chair. And I said, Erik, I'm going swimming with...
A girl?
Yeah.
Okay.
He was okay.
And I'm assuming he goes off with his girlfriend because he was actually dating Brent Spalding's sister. And so he goes off with this girl to go swimming in the lake there. And when he came back from the lake, Erik was gone. So that was the last time he states he remembered seeing Erik, which we will get back to that a little later because that is very controversial. Now, a lot of the information that I got in this case, timeline-wise, came from a family friend named Missy. And she did an interview with a podcast I'm going to mention a little bit later on again. And so she gave a lot of information on what they perceive the timeline to be in this case. And the story I heard from the family friend, Missy, suggested the following. Sometime after everyone was at this party, they were drinking, they were having fun, they were just being kids. Brent Spalding and his friend Tim Martin showed up at this party and they started causing havoc. I'm assuming someone probably went over to Brent, told him that his girlfriend was flirting with Erik a lot, and then Brent decided to go over to Erik and start harassing him. Brent allegedly went up to Erik and started calling him homophobic slurs that were really popular in the 80s. I'll let your mind wander to what that is. He was shoving him around, telling him no one wanted him to be there. He was just being a big fucking bully. And I'm sure like any other stereotypical situation where someone's getting bullied and there's a big bully, there's going to be a audience and a crowd that aren't doing anything to step in. I can't imagine if this did happen, how shitty that made Erik feel. At a party he just wanted to show up at and, have some drinks, have some fun, be a teenager, hang out with his friends. And apparently this was also the first party of the summer. And I'm sure because kids are assholes sometimes, that they were probably laughing at this situation. And those laughs were probably fueling Brent up, making him feel like this big, tough guy, especially someone who his girlfriend was apparently flirting with, which, if that is true, you think he'd be mad at his girlfriend for flirting with other guys, not the guy that she was flirting with. But if all of this was going on, it really makes me wonder, where the hell was Bill Cook during all of this? Was this all happening while he was swimming in the lake with his girlfriend or the girl that he went with down there? Or was Bill standing around watching this happen? It was getting to the point in the night now where everyone was so drunk that fights started happening. And this is where things start to remind me of the Kylie Rodney case. This is where I start to see the parallels, because both cases happened in a country setting in the woods where there's a bunch of teenagers drinking large amounts of alcohol and fights start breaking out. And then someone gets hurt. But no one talks about it. And no one seems to really want to talk about these fights. Now, it is stated that Erik didn't get in any fights this night, yet it's also stated that Brent was bullying Erik and, pushing him around and stuff like that. And then there's also allegedly a statement from Tim Martin, who was Brent's friend that he showed up with, where Tim Martin says that Brent was involved in a lot of fights that night, and it went so far as that Tim Martin had to physically pull Brent off of someone. And then from there's also statements that the family friend made that Brent allegedly beat up Erik that night. So there's all of these conflicting stories, and you will see if you start doing research on this case that the immediate sources that you see don't talk about a lot of this stuff. Very similar to the last case that I covered, the immediate articles that you will find when you start Googling this case and you start seeing, there's a Crime Watch Daily episode as well, is that they do talk about a lot of facts in this case, but all of these little details seem to be covered up or not talked about. And there apparently was so many interviews done with all of these kids. Yet why isn't this public knowledge? Why? At this point in the party, fights are breaking out. People are getting beat up allegedly. And this is what I find odd. Apparently, the parents that own this lake house came out and started breaking up this party, kicking everyone out, making them go home. And they even had to go as far as getting their neighbors to come help them to break up this party. It's just weird to me. That's a safer alternative, having the parents at this house. But that means that these parents were allowing this big kegger to happen. But if this party started turning out as violent as it did, where are these parents' statements saying that, Erik is getting beat up at this party? I don't see that. But we'll find out that there seems to be a lot of people that don't want to talk. So the party is now broken up. A witness told police that they saw Erik passing a gas station general store down the street from his home around 1:30 a.m. Now keep in mind, Erik and Bill showed up at this party around 7 to 7:30 p.m. Erik is now seen walking home at 1:30 a.m. That's a long time to be drinking, especially unlimited alcohol. And the weird thing about this witness statement is that while they seen Erik walking by this general store gas station, they also witnessed 2 cars parked at this gas station. Shortly after that, Erik's father remembers in the middle of the night hearing the front door handle rattling, and he was just assuming that it was Erik getting home and letting himself into the house. But the theory goes that Erik couldn't get into the home, so he ended up wandering back into the yard. But Jackie doesn't believe the theory that her brother Erik didn't get into the home and so he wandered back off, because she says if Erik couldn't get in the front door, he would have came and knocked on her window and woken her up so that she could let him in. But either way, Erik would never make it back inside of his home. And what happened after that has been a mystery for almost 40 years. 5 a.m. on June 26th now, so it's the next morning, Erik would have been walking home around 1:30 a.m. on the 26th. The Crosses say they heard a loud car with a muffler pulling into their driveway and then backing out and speeding off, and this woke them up. Around the same time, a neighbor in the area that was up also remembers hearing someone yell, "Oh my God, I think he's seen us," before this vehicle sped away. 20 minutes later, around 5:20 a.m., Erik's father decides, since they're already awake now because of this vehicle, that he's going to get up and go get the morning paper. But instead of the morning paper, he would find something much, much worse. Walking outside, he'd first notice a shoe that was in the middle of the driveway, and he would recognize this as his son Erik's shoe. Moving down the driveway a little bit more, Erik's father would end up seeing his son's mangled body laying in the middle of the road, which is just horrific for anyone to see, let alone a parent to find their own child's body, which is extensively damaged, we will find out, laying in the road in front of their home. Mr. Cross would end up being described as torn apart and hysterical, and he was crying. Him and his wife would both be described as just in complete shock, which would make sense when you hear that he ended up running over to Erik and flipping him over, and Erik was unrecognizable at this point. Erik was described as being cold to the touch, yet it was a warm, hot, humid summer morning. From there, Mr. Cross would run into the house and grab his wife, and then both of them would run outside to see their child. Seeing this horrible scene, his mother would then run back into the house and grab a blanket that she could cover Erik with, and then she would run over to a neighbor's to ask them if they could come help give CPR, because by a stroke of luck, their neighbors actually worked at the hospital, so she just wanted them to come as quickly as they could to try to administer CPR, even though Erik was cold to the touch, as Mr. Cross said. And when the neighbors got there and seen Erik, they actually attempted to try to help him. And it's said that they did this just to kind of try to make Mr. and Mrs. Cross feel like something could be done, even though they knew just by seeing Erik that he was way too far gone. Eventually, an ambulance would show up to pick Erik up, as well as the Kalamazoo police would show up on the scene. Police would find evidence of Erik's murder all up and down the road in front of Erik's home. Plastic from a vehicle, Erik's shoe, blood, Erik's actual body tissue and clothing ground into the cement. And all of this was over 600 feet up and down the road. Initially, this presented as a hit and run, and police would actually put out that this was a hit and run into the news and into the community. But things started not to add up very quickly. Police would start to put together that this wasn't a hit and run, and it was actually something much more sinister. So I'm going to present you with the scenario that has been all pieced together by both police and then the family friend and everyone that has been trying to gather evidence over the last 40 years on what happened to Erik after he left that party at 1 a.m. And again, keep in mind that this is the going theory, and most of this, unfortunately, is circumstantial evidence. It's not like there was a camera somewhere back in the 80s on this road or on this gas station that's seen this go down. This is just pieced together by a lot of witness statements that have been combined together over the last 40 years on what possibly could have happened that night. Now, the theory that the police put out, and this was a theory I seen on the Crime Watch Daily episode, a group of kids from that party, namely a few that I mentioned earlier, were sitting in those two vehicles that were sitting at that gas station when Erik walked by. And that these kids were still very fueled up from that party and those fights that were happening, and they wanted to continue them. And that theory was basically that Erik left the party at 1 a.m., he walked his way home, he couldn't get into the house, and then for whatever reason, he went back to these kids and they all decided to go hood surfing. And hood surfing, which is one of the stupidest things I've ever heard of, apparently was really popular in these rural towns back in the 80s. And it's basically what it sounds like. Kids would stand on the hood, or I guess the roof even, of a car like you would a surfboard, and then someone would drive around and you'd have to balance on this car like a surfboard. And it's just wild to me that someone thought that was ever a good idea. But apparently it was a popular thing kids would do. And I'm surprised not more kids got injured doing this. So basically the theory was they decided all go hood surfing like idiots, and that Erik had fallen off the hood and he was run over. That's basically a sum up of the theory that I seen on Crime Watch Daily. Now, that theory ran a lot deeper, and it seems that police would eventually lead into saying that they thought Erik had actually been tied to the back of a car with rope due to his injuries, I'll explain in a few minutes, and was dragged down the road. Now, I heard a very similar yet more detailed story from the family friend Missy that it seems that has been pieced together. And I'm sure if the police have all this information, which you think they would, they probably aren't putting it all out to the public because they're still trying to build a case against all of these people who are now adults. And honestly, after going through all of this and hearing this, this sounds very plausible to me. So basically, Missy says that there are witness statements that depict Erik being beat up at this party, and then him and Bill were put on a vehicle. Now, if that is true, I don't know how someone witnessed Erik walking by the gas station at 1:30 in the morning and seeing these two vehicles sitting at this gas station. It's probably a mix of all of that. Now, I wonder if Erik was beat up at this party and he decided to walk home because he was like, screw this. He's also, again, very drunk. He's wandering home. Maybe when he walked by this gas station, those two vehicles picked him up and took him back to the party to continue this like harassment. I don't know. Maybe Bill realized when he came back from swimming, realized Erik was gone. He grabbed some of his friends and were like, hey, can you drive me down? I need to go find Erik. And then things kind of just got out of hand because these friends were the ones that had been picking on him at the party, and Bill didn't know about it, maybe because he had been swimming, and then things just got out of hand completely, which would tie in Bill being involved with this in a capacity where it's like he feels very guilty because he didn't know all the details, but then he got involved in it all, and things just spiraled. It'll all make sense when I get to the end. Now, it is said that Erik was incoherent at this point and unconscious possibly, and Bill was not. So this is where all of this controversy comes in with Bill. I don't understand then if Erik was unconscious, how he would stay on the hood of a car. Maybe that's where the rope gets involved. Maybe Erik was tied to the car because he was incoherent and Bill got on top with him. Don't know why you would do that with your best friend. But from there, this vehicle would end up speeding off from Kimberlake Drive extremely fast. And this was described as in an attempt to show off. All of this would be happening around 1 a.m. And there are also statements where neighbors of the area, as well as the Cross family, heard a lot of commotion going on in the area and dogs barking. It is then said that this vehicle with the two boys on the top was speeding down the road by Erik's home. And whoever was driving this vehicle thought it was a smart idea to slam on the brakes. And so Bill rolled off from, the force of the stop. He rolled off to the left into the ditch. And this is where it's thought that Erik slid forward and it was actually pinned under the vehicle. Now, witness statements of people in the vehicle said, allegedly, that they thought Erik had also rolled off to the side like Bill did. But allegedly, there's statements by Brent's girlfriend, Amber, that she remembers feeling something underfoot. But that doesn't seem to be what had happened, because Erik actually would allegedly roll forward off the hood underneath the vehicle, and he would then be stuck under it and dragged over 172 feet down the road. Witnesses not connected to the party would be quoted saying that they heard someone screaming in the night at a distance. And this was described as a hell of a scream. And the theory Missy speaks about is that Erik was dragged under the vehicle. They ended up realizing what they had done. They got out, and when they seen the state of Erik, one of the girls from the vehicle screamed. And that is what this neighbor was hearing in the distance, that this person was screaming at the sight of Erik's body and the realization of what they had just done. It is then theorized that they then grabbed Bill Cook, got him back into the vehicle, and they sped off, leaving Erik in the road. Now, keep in mind, either theory, whether Erik really did leave the party and walk home around 1:30ish, or they were at the party, they drove off in the vehicle, it still would have happened around 1:30 in the morning. So that makes you wonder what happened between around 1:30 a.m. to 5:20 a.m. when Erik's father found him in the middle of the road. It's allegedly theorized from witness statements that they ended up driving off, leaving Erik's body in the road before coming back, putting Erik in the trunk, and then dropping him in front of his parents' house. And that's why Erik's body and pieces of his body and clothing and whatnot is seen so far down the road, but Erik is then dropped in front of the home. After that, it's thought that these kids involved ended up trying to kind of clean up. This is also when it's thought that a trailer hitch was dumped in a nearby pond. And this trailer hitch would actually be recovered by the Michigan State Dive Team in 2000, like 17 years later. And this trailer hitch would allegedly match injuries that were found on Erik's back during autopsy. If this really is what happened, which again, in my opinion, seems extremely plausible, it is disgusting. And keep in mind that everyone involved in this initial murder portion were all kids. It's just, ugh. And to murder someone in that way is just heinous. Again, remember though that this is all based off of alleged witness statements, circumstantial evidence. There is unfortunately nothing physical at this point in time that has been put out. And while this explains all of the evidence found up and down the road, I don't think it explains all of Erik's injuries, because Erik was injured badly. The list was extensive. And apparently all of his injuries haven't even been made public. They were that gruesome. Erik had deep abrasions. He had contusions. The vast majority of his skin had been road rashed. I seen up to 60% of his skin had been road rashed. He had leg fractures. He had a large laceration in his back. I also heard that he had been internally decapitated. But then it makes me go back to the rope burns and the fact that his skin had been twisted from the pressure of rope, which is what the police officer stated in the True Crime Daily episode. Now, the story that Missy talks about is that Erik was just placed on this vehicle. That's why I talked about maybe him being tied with rope to this vehicle, because the police officer in the True Crime Daily episode said that there were rope burns on Erik's skin possibly, you know, from it being twisted from the tension of a rope. And so I think that's where they come to this conclusion that he was possibly tied to the back of the vehicle and dragged down the road. And that's where it brings up the idea of possibly if this was a hate crime. If it is true where Missy said there were allegations that Brent came to that party and was calling Erik homophobic slurs, if he possibly wanted to get back at Erik for his girlfriend flirting at him, he was trying to demean him. Maybe he really did think that he was of the LGBT community. And as we know, back in the day, it still happens unfortunately in present time, but it was a lot more prominent back in the day, you know, 40, 50, 60 years ago, where people in the LGBTQ plus community were unfortunately murdered because of their status. And could this possibly be a hate crime where they did decide to tie him to the back of a vehicle and drag him because they thought this of him? Again, this is just a theory, not saying this actually did happen or that any of these people were involved with this happening, but it does track if it is true. Now, it could either be that, like the police officers were theorizing, or it could be like what Missy was saying, or it could be a combination of the both. Missy said that witnesses said he was placed in the vehicle, Bill got on the car with them. I don't know why Bill would get on the freaking front of the vehicle with him. But again, I don't even know why people would be car surfing to begin with, but apparently that happened. But maybe it is the possibility that Erik was tied to the front of the vehicle so that he wouldn't fall off initially because he was unconscious or whatever. And when they did stop really fast and Bill rolled off, that because of the rope, Erik ended up getting stuck on the vehicle and not rolling off like Bill did. And that's why he kind of fell under the vehicle and was stuck and then was dragged by the rope under the vehicle. Or a combination of the both. He might have fell off to the side and gotten dragged. Like, there's just too many scenarios there. But that would kind of make both scenarios make sense if you kind of combine them together. Either way, whatever happened to Erik was disgusting and horrendous. And this 16-year-old boy didn't fucking deserve that. So then it makes you wonder, who would have done this to this 16-year-old boy? Well, police say they went through hundreds of tips and interviews. And I think that's where a lot of these witness statements come from. And I think you already know from me mentioning specific names, telling you pay attention to these names throughout this video. Police will come out with a core group of persons of interest, and these are completely public knowledge because for 40 years they have been persons of interest in the murder of Erik Cross. But one guy would be pointed out as the ringleader and potentially the driver of the vehicle in Erik's murder, and that is town bully Brent Spalding. Brent Spalding, to this day, is law enforcement's prime suspect in Erik's murder, along with his girlfriend at the time, Amber Thomas. She was 15 at this time, which is just horrendous to me. I say that when there are multiple cases currently that I've talked about on this channel and that are currently unfolding still, where 14-year-olds have murdered people. But a group of kids around that age all conspiring together to even accidentally, and I say that very loosely, accidentally, murder him, because I don't think this is an accident at all. But even if they were to accidentally murder him in this way, where they were just trying to screw around and maybe bully him and tease him, and he ended up brutally dying. There's so many points of time they could have stopped and not done this at all. But to think that they would do this so intentionally is just horrific. Kids that age. Now, police believe that Amber was either in the vehicle at the time of Erik's death or she had knowledge of it after the fact. Now, none of this is really shocking about Brent when you find out that Brent Spalding had always had a bad rap. I will let you know he still has a bad rap to this very day. Brent Spalding was known to be a jerk and have a bad temper. An example I seen used was that even when he was a kid and he would make a threat towards someone, they would take that very seriously because they knew that he would follow through with it. There were multiple witness statements that said before Erik was even killed that Brent was going around calling himself Lucifer, that he thought he was the devil. But after Erik's death, Brent's life would continue to spiral and go very downhill. Allegedly, there was a witness statement that said that Brent had confessed to them that he had killed Erik. But either way, after Erik died, Brent was sent to a mental institution. Now, police think that this happened because Brent was trying to pull the old insanity card. But it's just really odd that before Erik's death that he was going around calling himself Lucifer, saying that he was the devil, and then he's sent to a mental institution. Now, the thing that really, really like just drove it home for me with Brent being involved in this is that Brent's car mysteriously went missing after Erik was found dead. And to this very day, Brent's missing vehicle has never been found. That right there, in my opinion, is a giant red flag. There's no way. There's no way, coincidentally, Brent is calling himself the devil and walking around being this huge town bully. Everyone knows him as this huge asshole. And then very soon after, their fellow classmate is brutally murdered by a vehicle. And then his vehicle just mysteriously goes missing, like right after the fact. It's just way too coincidental for me. But if it was his car involved and they've never found it to this day, they did a great job at covering up this case, because 40 years later and there are still no prosecutions in this case because there is no physical evidence, which just, it just irks me so bad, because all they need is something like that to prosecute this case, because no car, no evidence. And it just so happens that his vehicle went missing and it's never been damn found. It bothers me so much and it makes me so mad. As I said, Brent's life would continue to go downhill after Erik's death, despite him still being a free man till this day. And you can see it from these various mugshots throughout the decades. Brent would go on to have substance abuse issues, being in and out of the county jail on various charges, such as drunk and disorderlies, to aggravated stalking charges, and the list goes on. This is the face of someone, in my opinion, who is very, very guilty. And you see this a lot with people who are involved in something very traumatic, where they use substances to try to drown those feelings, even in situations where someone isn't guilty of murder. If they witness something very traumatic, and it would have been traumatic for all involved, witnessing and going through with the murder of Erik Cross, you think there would be a lot of guilt on the shoulders of those individuals involved in Erik's murder, where they would have to supplement it with alcohol and drugs to try to suppress those feelings and all of that horror that they witnessed. Red flag after red flag after red flag for me. Now, Amber Thomas would grow up from that young, innocent 15-year-old little girl, would go on to get married and have a couple kids of her own. And you think that having children of her own, she would look into her children's eyes and feel so guilty for being involved or having knowledge of a murder of a child. And that would make her finally speak up, but it unfortunately hasn't. Crime Watch Daily tried to go interview her. She immediately slammed the door in their faces.
I tried to speak with her too.
Amber? Hi. Anna Garcia from Crime Watch Daily. We'd like to talk to you about the Erik Cross case.
Oh, no, that's okay. Thanks.
But we'd really like to talk to you about what happened that night, Amber.
I guess self-preservation will always win out in the end, because if she came out now and admitted that she was involved in this, she would go to jail. And I doubt having the life she has now with kids and a husband and her home and just living the life of a free woman, that she wouldn't want to give it all away to go to jail, which she probably would if she was involved. The one person that I was really shocked at that would be involved in this was Bill Cook, Erik's best friend. And I mentioned it a bunch of times throughout this video that Bill is thought to have been involved in Erik's murder, but it's just shocking to me that to think that your best friend would be involved in your own murder is just, it's gross. It's horrendous to think that a best friend would be involved in something like this. But there are a lot of red flags with Bill and his story, and there are a lot of things pointing towards him being involved. Police stated that Bill was hanging out with that core group of people the night that Erik died. And Bill is tied to that core group of people. He was dating Brent Spalding's little sister. On top of that, it just so happens that Bill ended up actually sleeping over at Brent Spalding's house that night. He says that he slept over at Brent's house because, he was dating his sister. He slept over there with her sister, and he passed out because he was drunk and woke up in the morning and had no clue any of that had happened throughout the night. However, it is alleged that after Erik was found at 5 a.m. that morning, that Erik's father called over to Brent's house looking for Bill. And this is where the story comes from, where Bill claims that he was drunk and fell asleep and had no clue what happened that night. If that is true, why are there all these witness statements saying that Bill was put on top of a vehicle that night? If this is true, why didn't Bill stand up for Erik if he was getting beat up at this party? Even if he came back from swimming and heard this happen, I don't know. Allegedly, Bill actually had injuries on his body the next day Which, how would he get those if he was at the party? He says that he wasn't involved in any fights or anything. He went home and passed out and woke up in the morning, that he wasn't involved with anything at all. Bill apparently had road rash on his legs, which would line up more with him being on the vehicle and falling off and getting injured. But unfortunately, after the death of Erik, his family didn't know that Bill was involved with this as much as it's theorized he was, because Bill actually ended up with Erik's dog, Sally, which just goes to show that, like, the family loved and trusted Bill so much that, like, Bill was Erik's best friend. They didn't suspect that Bill would be involved initially. In present time, Bill seems to be the town outcast.
That's my friend, and I would never allow anybody else to do it.
But Bill has always been under suspicion because of his close Spalding connection.
I dated the sister of the person of interest.
And so that's why she and others think you might know something.
I believe so.
And do you know anything?
Absolutely not, ma'am.
He seems to be a man with a huge burden on his shoulders, and it's said that he hasn't been able to keep a job. Now, the reaction online to Bill's interview is not a good one. Everyone believes he was involved in the murder of his best friend. And it's disgusting if he was that he kept the secret all these years. And just like I said with Brent, it seems like Brent has a lot of red flags of substance abuse and like coping with trauma through substance abuse and alcohol. It seems that Bill also has this exact same issue. Bill's also been to prison over the years, just like Brent has. He also allegedly has, substance abuse issues or drinking issues. Like I said in the interview, he bawled his eyes out. Like, he just seems like someone that has this huge weight on his shoulders. And I think if it was anyone to come out and crack, it would be Bill. And again, people that have experienced trauma, which if Bill was there and went through all of that, he would be traumatized. It just makes sense that he would be coping with alcohol and drugs, and that he would have this huge burden and weight on his shoulders where he's crying in interviews over, his best friend's death, saying that he wasn't involved. But again, it's all circumstantial, unfortunately. You'd think, though, that after 40 years that someone would have came out and spoke if there was someone to come out and speak, especially since police say that they have 4 to 5 main suspects and that most of them, if not all of them, have failed polygraph tests multiple times. But no one's come out and spoke. There are, again, all these witness statements, though, but none of them have any physical evidence to piece together to actually form a conviction. It's as if all of these kids were involved, yet they all took a vow of silence to not speak about this, which is why this case reminds me so much of the Kiely Rodni case, because it's the same situation. A small rural town, a party of underage drinking happens, a bunch of fights break out, and then no one wants to speak about it afterwards. It seems that everyone in this town is tied together in some way. So it's like this vow of silence has happened to create this giant conspiracy and cover up. And it's like, in the end, everyone claims to know nothing. There is no possible way that no one knows nothing in this damn case. Erik's case has literally been called a conspiracy of silence and a cover-up. To this day, police still believe that all these individuals, their 4 to 5 main suspects, know something and they're just not saying it. 40 years later, and the same suspects from back in 1983 are still the prime suspects. That says something. 5 years ago, in 2017, murder warrants were put out and placed for the 5 suspects in Erik's murder. And these 5 murder warrants were out for Brent Spalding, Amber Thomas, Bill Cook, Tim Martin, and Brent's father, Brian Spalding Sr. But no charges were ever filed. The Attorney General's office would contact the Cross family and let them know that charges would not be moving forward because there was a lack of evidence. Because again, everything in this case, unfortunately, is circumstantial, because the murder weapon, aka the vehicle that killed Erik, has mysteriously never been found. And everyone involved in this case has taken a vow of silence to not turn on each other. So there's no one coming out that's like, I am going to go to court and testify that I was involved and so were these people. It's so unfortunate. It's like everyone knows what happened, allegedly what happened, but this case can't get prosecuted. Now, on the other hand, the family friend Missy actually is saying that the case can't move forward because the Attorney General's office actually made a mistake. And I find that Brent's father being involved with this is really interesting, because I said earlier in the video that it's all children involved with this case. And initially, I think it was children involved in this case. But I think once they went home and the story kind of started coming out in the news and people started whispering in the town, the parents of these children started getting involved. And allegedly, Brian Spalding Jr. was very cooperative with the police in the initial stages of the investigation. But again, allegedly, Brian told police that he was going to go home and speak to his son, and if he found out that his son was involved in this, he was never going to cooperate with police again. And coincidentally, Brian went home and then he never spoke to police again. On top of all of this, I find it really interesting that Amber and Bill have apparently been offered full immunity deals, but both of them turned them down. And Amber allegedly went into police and told them a bunch of stuff and was offered this deal, but then when it came down to actually, signing over this whole deal, she walked and didn't do it. Now, in present time, Missy and all of the people that are still fighting for justice for Erik still go around and post flyers and posters of Erik all around the town, try to keep the memory of Erik alive and this case alive so that hopefully someone will eventually come and talk. Unfortunately, it seems that people have been vandalizing these posters, though, where they're taking them down and putting them back up and writing on them "Justice for Brent," which is sick. And allegedly, the majority of this vandalization is going on by the children of some of these people of interest. It kind of makes me feel bad that these children are being dragged into all of this, and it's not their fault if their parents were involved. And of course, they're going to want to believe that their parents are innocent. But it really makes me sick that they're asking for justice for this man. This man that you see on the screen right now, and not for a 16-year-old boy who is brutally and horrifically murdered. Unfortunately, in 2007, Erik's father would end up dying without seeing justice for his son. And that really drives it home that this case is 40 years old. A lot of people in this case are unfortunately passing away that were either involved or indirectly involved in this case that may know information. The family is also aging and not seeing justice in this case. Now, I mentioned in the beginning of this video that a lot of the information I found on this case in the timeline was because a family friend named Missy did an interview, and she did an interview with a podcast called Jay with Justice. I'm gonna have that all linked down below so you can check that out. It's almost 2 hours long, I think. There's tons of information in it. I found it very interesting. Erik's sister, Jackie, also started a Facebook page that Missy helps run, and they did this so that they could generate tips and information on Erik's case. Jackie was quoted saying about the Facebook page, "My goal with the Facebook page was originally just to keep Erik's memory alive. It only evolved into being a tool to bring justice after so many other people became interested in his case, and so many people from Vicksburg contacting me expressing shock that no one had ever been arrested." And I agree. I am shocked that no one's been arrested either. To this very day, almost 40 years later, Erik's family and friends are still fighting for justice in Erik's murder. Erik's birthday just passed a few weeks ago. His family still holds vigils. They still post flyers and posters around the area. As I mentioned earlier, they're doing podcast interviews, trying to spread awareness about Erik, and they're doing their best that they can. And I'm hoping at this point his father didn't get to see justice, but his mother and his sister and the rest of his family and friends can see justice. Because if these individuals were 100% involved, they're still walking around out there right now. They're living their lives. They're hugging their children. They're sitting on their couch at night watching Netflix. If they were involved, it's because of them that Erik never got to experience any of that. He never got to experience getting married and having children. He never got to experience growing up. He never got to experience playing on a brand new PlayStation 5 or just going on road trips and adventures and just living his life. And that makes me really, really sad. Erik will never be older than 16 years old because a group of kids made a really stupid decision one summer night. So again, I will have all of the Facebook pages and websites and everything linked down below so you can look up more information and help support this family to find that justice. I'll have it all down below. If you are watching this video right now and you know something, you need to speak up. You need to contact the authorities. You need to do the right thing because at this point, it's been 40 years almost. Let's give Erik and his family some closure. With that, thank you for hearing Erik's story and his case. If I left anything out or if you have any more information and you want to leave it down below, I want to start a conversation with this. Again, please go check out the Facebook page as well. Go support the family there. Thank you all for joining me in this. If you are not subscribed, please hit that subscribe button so that I can continue to bring you stories like these so we can help spread the word about cases like these and hopefully they can get some justice too. Stay safe out there and I will see you in the next video. Bye.